What was your first memorable encounter with poetry? Was it a Mother Goose rhyme a parent or grandparent read you before bed? Hush, little baby, Little Miss Muffet, the itsy bitsy spider? Maybe you, like me, learned how to multiply with rhymes. When I struggled with my 8 times tables, my teacher taught me, I ate and ate and got sick on the floor. 8 times 8 equals 64. Maybe instead poetry helped you with your grammar. Remember Schoolhouse Rock? Conjunction, junction, what's your function? Don't worry, I won't do the whole thing. But if none of these, I know you learned how to make decisions with our favorite nonsensical rhyme, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. So when did poetry lose its value for you? Were you, like most people, late in your middle school years, reading your first Shakespearean sonnet confused? Maybe it was Ode on a Grecian urn, and you failed your first class comprehension test. When most people are unlearning poetry's value, I was becoming increasingly aware of poetry's power to change the direction of my life. I had my first powerful encounter with poetry in the 7th grade. After years battling my mom in court, my father won custody. But although the judge awarded him custody, she hadn't completely believed me, or my accounts of my mom's alcoholism. I don't entirely blame the judge. These battles had been ongoing since my parents' separation when I was 3 years old, but I wasn't invited into the conversation until elementary school. And even though my brother and I were the only first-person witnesses to my mom's behaviors, no one was sure they could trust the accounts of such young children. Could we really read her bottles? How did we know it was alcohol or that she was drunk? Who taught us these things? So when I was called to the stand in the 4th grade, it shouldn't surprise you that the first question my father's lawyer asked me was, do you know what it means to tell the truth? I did my best to respond. To say what happened, I told them. And since we went on with the questioning, I believed my answer was enough. But years later, we still fought. Visitations weren't suspended, just shortened. In the 7th grade, I was frustrated with the situation and decided to write the judge a letter. I included a prose poem I wrote for my online creative writing class. Here's an excerpt. "Get in the car now," she screamed. And because of her condition, she was a mess. Her hair was unkempt and her clothes were wrinkly. Her eyes had dark circles beneath them and her voice was loud. Her voice made courage run and it slapped my conscience. Yet it wasn't really her voice. It was the alcohol speaking. It was the alcohol that consumed her. It was a poison to her physically, but perfume to her soul. It was her escape, yet her trap. It was her fortress and her debris. It was the destroyer of our lives. "No, we're not going anywhere," I said, desperately trying to catch my fleeing courage. At the same time, my eyes locked on my brother, grasping my mother's leg, and when I saw the fear in his eyes, I caught the fear too. "Didn't you hear me? Get in the car, now!" I no longer resisted. My brother and I gravely went into the car. Silence was the fog in the vehicle's atmosphere. No one wanted it, but it was there. No one could do anything about it. We were getting in that car. We were leaving our home. And at 6 years old, I was praying that we would make it back. I wasn't called into the courtroom to speak that day, and I didn't hear what the judge had said. But I know the visitations had stopped. I never missed another day of school for court. My dad told me how the judge was livid with my mother. Had been one of the first times in her career she would award a father full custody. My mom walked out like she'd been crying. For the first time, I felt not only heard, but understood. I had my second memorable encounter with poetry in the 10th grade. I was bored in English class and I was flipping through my textbook when I stumbled on this Lucille Clifton poem, Miss Rosie. It goes like this. "When I watch you, wrapped up like garbage, sitting surrounded by the smell of 2 old potato peel, or when I watch you in your old man shoes with a little toe cut out, sitting, waiting for your mind like next week's grocery. I say when I watch you, you wet brown bag of a woman. Used to be the best looking gal in Georgia. Used to be called the Georgia Rose. I stand up. Through your destruction, I stand up. I never forgot the lines I read that day. When I watch you wrapped up like garbage. Before this poem, I had never read anything that changed the way I saw something I encountered in my daily life. I had never pictured homelessness this way before, as discards, curbside, waiting for her mind like next week's grocery. I read it over and over again, thought about how I processed failure. I stand up, through your destruction, I stand up. Reverent, resistant. I remember those lines still when she died. I was a junior in high school, and it was a year after I found that poem. I was so sad to hear of her death, knowing I would never get the chance to meet her, and so I wrote an ode to her. I ended my poem, Laurels for Lucille, with the same 3 lines. I stand up, through your destruction, I stand up. And while Miss Rosie was a powerful poem for me then, it wasn't until last year that I understood what I experienced when reading Miss Rosie was empathy. And it wasn't a poet who taught me that either. An engineer I knew told me I taught him the importance of emotions with my poetry. He said reading my poetry gave him a capacity for processing his emotions, the same way reading Miss Rosie gave me new ways to envision and process failure or grief. He helped me understand that the vulnerability, rhythm, and curiosity explored in poetry creates an intimacy that goes far beyond entertainment. Folklorist Stephen Zeitlin has a similar perspective he shares in his book, The Poetry of Everyday Life. He argues that people are poetry. He says, as we become more intimate with one another, our conversations shift from prose to poetry. Our talk becomes increasingly patterned and rhythmic. The problem is, there are only a finite number of people we encounter who are willing to develop a language and share that level of intimacy with us. Written or spoken poetry can fill the gaps in our life, where people won't travel or don't. It's important to understand the poems are not clear-cut answers or scientific facts, but rather exploration of real and fictional events, general questions, and emotional reactions. And of course, not all poetry does this or has to, but what I'm addressing here are the possibility poetry offers to both readers and writers alike, the emotional experiences that build emotional literacy over time. Regardless of content or form, every poem has the opportunity to change the direction of your life. Every poem has a personality. Every poem is a vehicle for traveling deeper into your inner life and the inner life of others. Every poem can provide new techniques for processing emotions we may or may not have already encountered, like in this Rumi poem, The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. So momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house, empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes. Zeitlin points out that now, after reading that poem, when I have panic attacks, I know that it's not me. I just have a really bad visitor. I need to sweep out our house, to let him in and let him go. Poetry helped him process a situation in his daily life that caused him pain and gave him insight for how to move forward. But we're not the only people who are noticing poetry's power to change our lives and emotional well-being for the better. Many around us are using poetry to spark social change and bridge cultural gaps. Instagram poets like Rupi Kaur and Nahira Waheed are making poems resonating with millions, like these Waheed poems. If you show someone the sun in your bones and they reject you, you must remember they hurt themselves this very same way. I am trying to remember you and let you go at the same time. News publishers like NPR, the New York Times, and BuzzFeed are publishing modern academic poets like Hava Akbar and Anders Carlson Wee. Modern publishers like Penguin and Norton are printing editions of modern poetry books like Madness, Instant Winner, Calling a Wolf a Wolf. In St. Paul, Minnesota, they're repaving sidewalks with poems to inspire people as they walk down the street. In Smoketown, Kentucky, Hannah Drake began an initiative called One Poem at a Time to replace predatory advertising with positive messages and cultural artifacts from the local townspeople. Now, instead of cigarette and fast cash ads, they get to see poems. In New York City, City Lore hosts poetry dinners and drives a traveling poem-mobile. The poem-mobile is this brightly colored truck that accompanies poets to literary events in town. It projects the poems on city buildings in various languages, so people of all different tongues can feel the power of poetry in the language they understand best. But probably the most powerful recent example of poetry's ability to unify was at the Women's March, when singer Halsey's poem about the sexual violence she's faced went viral, stirring global conversations and solidarity. The first story her poem tells is this one. It's 2009 and I'm 14 and I'm crying. I'm not really sure where I am, but I'm holding the hand of my best friend Sam in the waiting room of a Planned Parenthood. The air is sterile and clean, and the walls are that not gray but green, and the light is so bright it could burn a hole through the seam of my jeans. My phone is buzzing in my pocket. My mom is asking if I remembered my keys because she's closing the door and needs to lock it, but I can't tell my mom where I've gone. I can't tell anyone at all. You see, my best friend Sam was raped by a man that he knew because he worked at the after-school program. And he held her down with her textbook beside her, and he covered her mouth and came inside her. So now I'm with Sam at the place with a plan, waiting for the results of a medical exam. She's praying she doesn't need an abortion. She couldn't afford it, and her parents would, totally kill her. In our rather newly globalized world culture and economy, it is increasingly more important that we empathize with our neighbors. Last year, hate crimes were on the rise in the US, around 20% in the major cities and 5% nationally. Ames is no exception. Even here, a few months ago, there were hate crimes in the local high school targeting students of color. If we would listen, and listen by reading, what more could we understand about each other? What more could we understand about ourselves? I wonder sometimes who I'd be if I never wrote the poem I shared with the judge that day. Would she have believed me? Would she have understood my pain? If I hadn't read the Lucille Clifton poem, I wouldn't have written the ode elegy that gave me my first writing award. I'd process failure and grief differently. Perhaps I wouldn't be writing professionally now. Just as it had in my life, poetry can change the direction of yours. Writing can give you space to explore. Reading can give you new techniques for emotional processing. But know this, with understanding comes responsibility, and achieving emotional literacy takes risks. Are you willing to be the vulnerable 13-year-old testifying against your mother? Are you willing, when the time comes, to be the receptive judge that listens? Thank you.